Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to the Linguistics 101 video series. This is the last video I'm going to make in this series on the topic of syntax before we move on and start talking about semantics. Now, of course, as you can see in this video, we're going to be talking about binding theory and C command, which I will explain coming up in the following slides, along with why it's okay to have sentences like "it's raining men," but you could never say something like "it's raining themselves." Of course, if you've been following the series, you know that in the last few videos we've been talking about sentence structure and the ways that your sentences form trees with all the different words being different branches in the trees and how they can go a lot deeper than what you might have originally thought. But in this video, we're going to be talking about how that structure can be useful in helping us understand different problems and different questions that we might ask ourselves about the way language works. So, before we go into anything else, we have to talk about binding. Binding is an example of a concept that is sensitive to the syntactic structure of our sentences. And this is what allows us to have sentences like Romeo killed himself, where Romeo and himself both refer to the same person. And binding theory is also going to help us answer a lot of questions that we might ask about the limits on our language. It explains why in an ungrammatical sentence like Romeo thinks that Juliet killed himself, there's nobody that himself can refer to and still be grammatical. And I'm sure you're thinking, well, duh, of course Juliet can't be himself because she's a girl. But there's more that goes into it than just that. Why can't himself refer to Romeo like it does in the first sentence? You might think that it's because Romeo comes before Juliet and himself has to refer to the last person mentioned. But that's not it. Because we can have sentences like this one where Romeo comes first, Juliet comes in the middle, and then himself comes last at the end but still refers to Romeo at the beginning. And binding theory can also help us understand why in sentence 3 there is one possible interpretation that we can get for the word himself, but it's different than the interpretation of the very same word in sentence 1. So the big question we're going to ask in this video is, why is it that in sentence 1 the word himself refers to Romeo, but in sentence 3 the very same word is not allowed to refer to Romeo? Why is it only allowed to refer to Hemingway? Well, to answer that question, there's 3 principles that determine how different types of words can refer to the same entity or how they bind one another. If you're reading these 3 principles right now, I'm sure you don't understand any of it, and that's okay. I'm going to take us step by step and go through each of these principles and explain what they mean in this video. But before we do that, we're going to have to go over a little bit of terminology. So an antecedent is a word that gives meaning to another word in the sentence. I've underlined the antecedents in these 2 example sentences below, and the words in bold are the words that they give meaning to. So in the sentence, Indy said he hates snakes, the antecedent is Indy, and you wouldn't understand who he is if it wasn't preceded by the antecedent. In the second example, you wouldn't understand who himself refers to if it wasn't preceded by the antecedent, a fool. Coindexing is when you have 2 nouns that both refer to the same person or thing. And there's a little bit of notation that you're going to have to learn regarding this concept. When we have 2 noun phrases that are coindexed, or they refer to the same thing, they will both be followed by the same subscript letter. In this case, Simba and himself both refer to the same person or animal, and so they both have the same subscript I following them. In the next sentence, Simba sees him, the pronoun him cannot refer to Simba, so that's why we put a little star next to the subscript I to show that it cannot coindex with Simba. So then what we do is we give him a subscript J without a star in front of it to show that him must refer to some other entity that's not mentioned in this sentence. And if you want, we can also include a J with a star in front of it in the first sentence to show that in sentence 1, himself can only refer to Simba and not some other entity that exists outside of the sentence. And we're going to give a little letter to everything that we might coindex in the sentence. So Simba gets the first letter I, and then Simba's father, the entire noun phrase, gets the letter J. So we see that in this sentence, the word himself can only refer to the noun phrase Simba's father. It can't refer to Simba, and it can't refer to someone else who is not mentioned in the sentence. So back to the question at hand. Why can't the word himself in this sentence refer to Romeo? Why can't it refer to anyone other than Hemingway? The reason is that the word himself is a type of NP called an anaphor. Anaphors are those words that usually end in self, like himself, herself, thyself, ourselves, and then there's some other strange ones like one another or each other. And an anaphor can only derive its meaning from another word in the same sentence. That's why you can have a sentence like it's raining men, or you could even have a sentence that says it's raining them, but you could never have a sentence that's grammatical in English that says it's raining themselves, because themselves is an anaphor and it needs an antecedent to precede it to tell us what themselves is. Without the antecedent, the anaphor makes no sense. So now we've determined what an anaphor is, and we've determined that himself at the end of our sentence is an anaphor, and we've determined that it requires an antecedent to precede it in the sentence. But so far, all this information doesn't seem to solve the problem of why himself can't refer to Romeo. Why can it only refer to Hemingway? Both of these names come previously in the sentence before the anaphor, so why couldn't either of them serve as the antecedent for himself? The answer is that in human language, you can have sentences within sentences within sentences. I call them inception sentences. So you take the full sentence, Hemingway killed himself, and you put it inside the larger sentence, Romeo thinks that Hemingway killed himself. And it turns out that there's another constraint on anaphor usage. Not only must an anaphor coindex with an antecedent in the same sentence, but it must coindex with an antecedent in the smallest sentence that contains it, or the smallest clause that contains it. So in this example, the anaphor himself is limited to finding its antecedent only within the sentence, Hemingway killed himself. Because it's an anaphor, it's not able to reach out into the larger sentence and take Romeo as its antecedent. Now, before we go any further with syntax, we have to talk a little bit about semantics, which is the study of meaning. And we're going to talk about where certain types of noun get their meaning from. So from a semantic standpoint, we have three types of nouns, and they each have their own syntactic distribution, or they have their own ways of behaving in syntax trees. Our expressions express content. They're pretty straightforward. You just look at the word and you know what it refers to. But pronouns don't have a meaning that's intrinsically linked to something in the world. They have to get their meaning either from a previous word in the sentence, or from a word in a previous sentence, or just from context. And the third group is the anaphor, which must get its meaning from another word in the sentence. And specifically, anaphors must get their meaning from another word that is in the same clause, the smallest clause that contains the anaphor. Now, I've had people tell me that they were taught in English class that an anaphor is a type of pronoun, but in this video, we're going to keep them separate because they do different things and they have different roles in syntax. And I know that's a lot to take in, so if we look at this example, Jojo was a man who thought he was a loner. Jojo is an R expression. Jojo is the name of a person who's in the world, and the name is linked to the person. He is a pronoun, and it gets its meaning from Jojo. So Jojo is the antecedent of he. Now, you can also have pronouns that don't have an antecedent. For example, in the sentence, he thought he was a loner. In this sentence, there's no R expression for he to refer to, so he has to get his meaning either from a previous sentence in the discourse or from context. Like you could just point to a guy and say, he said he was a loner. In the example, Ace hid himself in a rhino, Ace is the R expression. It's a person with a name, and they're linked together. And himself is an anaphor that gets its meaning by referring to ace. So ace is the antecedent of himself, and we wouldn't understand who himself is without ace. Now let's take another example. Romeo killed Tybalt. This sentence is pretty straightforward. It's 3 words long, 2 nouns, 1 verb, and those 2 nouns are our expressions, so we just understand what they mean. Romeo and Tybalt are both easy to understand, and we have no problem calling this sentence grammatical. But now let's look at a very similar sentence. Romeo killed him. Even though this sentence looks a lot like the previous one, it's not, because we've replaced an R expression with a pronoun, which behaves in a very different way. And you're probably tempted to say that this sentence is clearly grammatical, just like the last one. But it's more complicated than that. The word him doesn't pick out a clearly defined entity in the world like Tybalt does. So we have to ask ourselves, who is him? Well, the most natural thing to assume is that the pronoun him refers to Tybalt. Notice the little subscript i's that tell us that we're assuming Tybalt and him are coindexed. It's natural to assume this because we know Romeo killed Tybalt. And if that is in fact the intended meaning of the word him, then we're left with a grammatical sentence. But if you ignore your previous knowledge of Shakespeare, this pronoun could mean a lot of different things. And if instead of Tybalt we coindex him with Friar Laurence, we're still left with a grammatical sentence that has the same meaning as Romeo killed Friar Laurence. It may not be a true sentence, but it's grammatical. And even if the pronoun refers to someone who's still alive, it's still a grammatical sentence. But there are limits on the meanings that we can read into the word him. It can't refer to just anybody. If we try to make it refer to Juliet, our sentence is ungrammatical, and that's why you see the little star at the beginning of the sentence. Because the masculine pronoun him cannot coindex with Juliet because she's a woman. And similarly, our pronoun cannot coindex with the knights who say ni, because even though they're the right gender, they're the wrong grammatical number. Him is a singular pronoun and can't refer to anything plural. Now, with all that said, the word him in this sentence can grammatically refer to any single male in the entire universe and in any fictional universe other than Romeo. So the sentence Romeo killed him might mean Romeo killed Tybalt, or Romeo killed Marty McFly, or Romeo killed Fingtem, depending on who uttered the sentence. But it cannot possibly refer to Romeo, unless there's another person named Romeo. Because even though Romeo is the right gender and number to fit the bill, there are syntactic constraints that prohibit us from coindexing the word him with Romeo in this sentence. And there's lots of little interesting ways that we're prohibited from coindexing one NP with another one. Ways that you're not allowed to use certain types of nouns in relation to other ones. So there also must be some syntactic rule that explains why Romeo killed himself is perfectly fine, but himself killed Romeo is just awful. And be careful, because your first instinct would probably be to say that we can just explain this by saying that the antecedent must come before the anaphor in the sentence. But that's not really the answer we're looking for, because it doesn't explain a sentence like this. Ariel's father loves herself. In this sentence, Ariel comes before the anaphor herself, but they still can't coindex because of a structural constraint on anaphors. We've already mentioned that an anaphor must find its antecedent within the same sentence that contains it, and specifically within the smallest clause that contains it. And if that were the only rule, then this sentence would check out, because Ariel is indeed found within the smallest clause that contains the anaphor herself. There's another constraint on anaphor usage that makes this sentence ungrammatical, and that is that an anaphor must be C-commanded by its antecedent. So what does C-command mean? The easiest way to understand C-command is with a simplified family tree that only branches downward. And yes, I'm sorry for leaving out the most important node in this family tree. I just didn't have enough space. But basically, you C-command your siblings and your nieces and nephews and your great nieces and nephews, and their children, and their children, and their children, and turtles all the way down. So in the Lannister family, if Kevin is Tywin's brother, then Kevin sea commands Tywin. But he also sea commands all of Tywin's offspring. And if Jaime is Cersei's brother, and only her brother, then he sea commands Cersei, Joffrey, Tommen, and Myrcella, and any future children that they might have. But he doesn't sea command Tywin or Lancel or anyone else in this family tree because sea command doesn't move up in the tree. It can only move to the sister node and then downwards. So you never sea command your parents or grandparents or your aunts and uncles or cousins, but only your siblings and their descendants. So sea command is a pretty basic concept until it comes to incest. So now going back to our Little Mermaid example, we can explain that Ariel is not an appropriate antecedent for the word herself, even though the name Ariel comes first in the sentence and is found within the same smallest clause as the anaphor and is the right gender and the right number. It's still ungrammatical because Ariel does not sea command the anaphor herself. So if we were going to analyze this sentence and look for an appropriate antecedent for our anaphor, we would look at the two NPs at the beginning of the sentence and say, hey, here's two good-looking NPs. Let's play matchmaker and try to see if we can find a good antecedent for the anaphor. So we would check out the first NP, which is Ariel, but that's not a good antecedent for herself because it doesn't sea command herself. It only sea commands what's in the D bar, because remember, the sea command can't go up. It can only go sideways and then down. Likewise, when we look at the noun father, we see that it also does not sea command herself. It only sea commands the determiner. So the only other node that we might try to coindex with herself, and that also sea commands herself, is the entire DP, Ariel's father. And in this case, our potential antecedent does sea command the anaphor, but of course we know that herself cannot coindex with the DP, Ariel's father, because of the gender discrepancy. And now, if you fully understand the concept of sea command and the concept of coindexing, then we can combine them together and define the term binding. Because the two important concepts in binding are sea command and coindexing. One node is said to bind another node if the first one sea commands the second one and they both are coindexed. But notice that this is an asymmetrical relationship. So just because node A binds node B, that doesn't necessarily mean that node B binds node A. So the concept of binding allows us to take our two rules that we mentioned earlier, that an anaphor must coindex with an antecedent in the smallest clause that contains it, and an anaphor's antecedent must sea command it, and we can combine them into a single binding principle. An anaphor must be bound from within the smallest clause that contains it, or an anaphor must have an antecedent that binds it from within the smallest clause. Now this is actually the first of the three binding principles that I mentioned towards the beginning of the video, and hopefully now they'll make a little bit more sense. The second principle is basically the exact opposite of the first one, but it applies to pronouns rather than anaphors. So while an anaphor must be bound within the smallest clause that contains it, a pronoun is prohibited from being bound from within the smallest clause that contains it. And in our expression, just cannot be bound. That sounds like a lot of gibberish, but it makes a lot of intuitive sense, because it's why you can't have phrases like Romeo killed Romeo. Because then the second time you said Romeo, it would be bound by the first time you said Romeo. So the simplest way I can explain these three concepts is by saying that 1, an anaphor must have a nearby antecedent. Nearby meaning within the same clause. 2, a pronoun can have an antecedent as long as the antecedent is not nearby or does not sea command the pronoun. And in our expression, just can't have an antecedent that sea commands it. So now that we understand the principles of binding, I'm going to give you a minute to try to see if you can figure out how these apply to real life sentences. We already know intuitively whether a sentence is grammatical or ungrammatical, but I want you to understand how these three principles explain the grammaticality or the ungrammaticality of the following sentences. So I'm going to give you a minute to pause the video and try to see if you can figure out how principle 1 explains why this sentence can have one possible meaning for the anaphor himself. So in other words, himself can coindex with Hemingway, but it cannot coindex with Romeo, and it cannot coindex with any other entity not mentioned in the sentence. All right, pause the video, try to figure it out, and the answer is that in binding principle 1, an anaphor must be bound from within the smallest clause that contains it. The smallest clause that contains himself is the clause, Hemingway killed himself. So the only thing that's allowed to bind himself is Hemingway. Romeo and any other male entity that could possibly coindex with himself are outside of the binding domain or the smallest clause that contains the anaphor, so they're off limits as potential antecedents. Now pause the video and try to see if you can figure out how the second binding principle explains why the pronoun in this sentence may refer to any other single man, but it cannot possibly refer to Romeo. And I'll give you a second to pause, try to figure it out, and of course the answer is a pronoun must not be bound from within the smallest clause that contains it. And the smallest clause that contains him in this sentence is the only clause, Romeo killed him. So him cannot find its antecedent from within this clause, so Romeo is off limits. So him has to find its meaning from somewhere outside of this sentence. But if we add another clause into the sentence, like Romeo thinks that Tybalt killed him, Romeo is no longer in the same smallest clause that contains the pronoun him. So Romeo is now an acceptable antecedent for him. So Romeo thinks that Tybalt killed him might mean Romeo thinks that Tybalt killed Romeo. Even though that would be kind of a bizarre understanding of this sentence, it's at least grammatical. And now pause the video again, and I'm going to give you a minute to see if you can figure out how the third principle of binding explains why there is no grammatical reading of this sentence. So go ahead and pause the video, and of course the answer is our expressions must not be bound. So what is binding again? It means that it's coindexed with an antecedent, and it means that the antecedent C commands the R expression. Since himself in this sentence C commands Romeo, they're not allowed to coindex. And that's all for this video. Thanks so much for watching. If you want more videos on linguistics and languages, go ahead and click the subscribe button and the little bell next to it, and then you'll get notifications every time I release new content. And I'll see you guys next time.